Good evening. We will begin in about 5 minutes. Good evening. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the ARK-aeology Files. My name's Katie. I'm an archaeologist with Digging Your Bible, and I'll be taking you on a tour of Egypt this evening. But before we begin, I'd like to take a moment and just bow our heads for a word of prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for being with us this evening. Thank you for guiding us safely through another week. Please put your hand of protection on us for this week ahead and be with us as we study your word and we look into the lives of Joseph and Levi and Moses and the Israelites in Egypt. In your name we pray, amen. Okay, so I hope you've come prepared. We're going to talk a little bit about the life of the Israelites before they entered Egypt, and then afterwards we're going to be covering some of the plagues. So buckle up. Just want to remind everybody from what we discussed last week, which was the sons of Jacob. We learned about how they sold Joseph into the land of Egypt. He took one of these two routes that are shown on the screen right now. The route to the south and to the east was called the King's Highway. Then we also had the highway that went from Damascus down to Egypt that went through the land of Canaan. So now we are at the point where the Israelites are getting ready to move into the land of Egypt. And I just want to take a moment to give a shout out to Jessica in Heaven Soon. So nice for you to join us this evening. Glad that you could be with us tonight. When we are looking at Israel and Egypt, I want to make sure that you feel free to throw any questions in the chat box. This is the time for us to discuss all of this. So if you have a question, please pop it in that chat box. We do have a couple of segments where I'll be asking questions, so I'll be looking to see if those responses are in there. If you just want to play along at home, feel free to do that as well. When we are looking specifically at the Israelites and their stay in Egypt, we're going to be asking these 5 questions. Which patriarchs were involved? When were they there? How long were they there? What's the name of the pharaohs? And the biggest one that everybody always asks, is there any evidence? For the first question, which patriarchs? Well, we've got a timeline here. We have some patriarchs that are named from Abraham and Jacob and Moses and Isaac and the 12 tribes. So let's take a moment and review. We know that Abraham went into Egypt. So we will give Abraham a check mark. Abraham was at one point in Egypt. He went back to Canaan. What about Isaac? What are your thoughts? Did Isaac go to Egypt or did Isaac not go to Egypt? So this is one of the times where you're going to have to sit there and think about it and put your answer or get your answer ready. Then we're going to move to Jacob. Was Jacob ever in Egypt? How is Jacob? What is his relationship with Egypt? What about the 12 tribes? Were the 12 tribes in Egypt? From the actual sons of Jacob to the descendants of those sons. Were they in Egypt? And then was Moses in Egypt? So let's go through. We're going to go back to Isaac. Isaac was not ever in Egypt. He went to go to Egypt. He was not there. Jacob, however, he did go to Egypt. The sons of Jacob and their descendants, they went to Egypt. And of course, if they went to Egypt, that means that Moses was also there. And then just a quick flashback from last week on Isaac and looking at possible famines from Neferkasokar. This is from the Book of the Temple, but we really don't know exactly which one of the early pharaohs. But this does answer our question about which patriarchs were in Egypt. Now, when were they there? This is when we go back to the temple. So we've got to fast forward a little bit to be able to go backwards. If we are looking at the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, and then the destruction of Solomon's temple by the Babylonians. We know that that occurred in 588 BC. Some people say 586, but generally around that time. So we're going to use 588. We're going to go back to when the temple was first built, and we can determine this by all of the kings list. You can use Ezekiel, 2 Kings, Chronicles. It's approximately 400 years if we're looking at very specifically. It would indicate when you're looking at Ezekiel and Jeremiah and 2 Kings that it was 396 years. So we're going to be using that 396-year time frame. But from when the temple was burned to when it was begun is about 396 years, which puts the temple construction around 984. Why is this important? Because if we go to 1 Kings 6:1, we have a clue about when the Exodus occurred. And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziph, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. So if we're looking at this on a timeline, we're going to go back from when the temple was constructed, and we're going to go back 480 years. And this gives us an Exodus date of 1464 BC, and we can go back 80 years from that to the birth of Moses. So we know that Moses was born sometime around 1544 BC, which means that we know for a fact that the Israelites were in Egypt, biblically speaking, at least between 1544 BC and 1464 BC. But that now brings us to the next question in our tour, which is, how long were the Israelites in Egypt? And this is where a lot of people have debates about. And people this is the hill that they will die on, because there's some answers that are probable, other answers that are not so probable. And we are going to look at all of the answers and see which one you're going to guess. So were they in Egypt for 80 years? Were they in Egypt for 215? Was it 400? Was it 430? Or was it another time frame? What do you think as far as how many years the Israelites were in Egypt in total, from the time when Jacob went in with the family to the time of the Exodus? How many years do you think that was? I'm going to pause for a minute to let you think about that. Jessica, it's so good to see that you're following along in your study Bible. I always love those to see what the other archaeologists are saying and how they're relating that. It's fantastic. Sometimes there's a big difference of opinion, and other times everybody pretty much has the same general idea. So when we are looking, I see some answers coming in. We have somebody's guessed C. Are you ready to actually find out what this answer is, biblically speaking? The answer is actually B, 215 years. Now, before you stop and be like, hold it, I know the Bible says something different. Let's actually look at what the Bible says. We're going to turn to Exodus 12, verses 40 through 41. Now, the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. So you're going to say, hey, Katie, that right there tells you they were there for 430 years. But let me introduce you to something called comma placement and misplaced modifiers. When they were writing the Bible, they did not originally have the commas and the quotation marks. That was something that was added later during the translations. And the best example of this is actually if you turn to Luke 23:43, where Jesus is talking to the thief on the cross, and Jesus says, "Verily I say unto thee, today shalt thou be with me in paradise." This is an example of a misplaced comma. The comma actually should be after the words today, because if we go to John 12:17, we find that Jesus did not ascend to paradise that very day. We are talking days later when Jesus is with Mary Magdalene and he says, "Don't touch me. I haven't been there yet." So if Jesus had told the thief on the cross, "Today you're going to be with me," and then today the thief wasn't with him, that would not be a truth. So when Jesus is talking, he is actually saying, "I'm telling you this today, this day, here and now, that you will eventually be with me in paradise." But he was stating the time frame from which he was speaking. This is something that we see throughout the Bible in various other instances. But going back to this particular verse in Exodus 12, the "who dwelt in Egypt," this is actually a modifier for describing where the children of Israel were when the sojourning ended, not when the sojourning began, not throughout the entire duration. And here is how we know this. We're going to compare this to another verse in the Bible. So turn with me to Galatians 3:17-18. And here Paul is talking about the 10 Commandments. And he says, "And this I say, that the covenant that was confirmed before of God was 430 years after God gave it to Abraham by promise." So Paul is talking about the 10 Commandments, otherwise known as the covenant, hence the name, the Ark of the Covenant. Paul is talking about these 10 Commandments being given 430 years after God spoke to Abraham. If we look on our timeline for this, so we take the Exodus in 1464 and we go back 430 years, we find that Abraham is 75 years old and it's 1894 BC. So let's look at Abraham's talks with God to make sure that we are determining the right talk, because Abraham talked with God 3 different times. First time that he talked to God, he was 75 years old, and that is when him and God made a covenant, or they made a pact. God said, basically, pick up everything that you own, go to this land, and if you do that and you follow me, I will make you a great nation and my blessing will be with you. So Abraham says, "You know what? I like the sound of that." And he packed up and he moved, and that began the 430-year covenant. But somewhere between the age of 76 and 85 years old, Abraham gets a little impatient and he's sitting there. He's like, "Okay, well, I don't have any kids yet, Lord. So what's going on here?" And him and God have a conversation again. And this is where God gives him a timeline and says, for 400 years, it's going to be affliction and being treated badly and put into bondage. And then the third time that Abraham talks to God is when he is 99, and that is when God changes his name to Abraham from Abram. So now we have 2 different dates. We have 430 years and we have 400 years. When we look, we can find this in Genesis 15, Acts 7, Exodus 12, and Galatians 3. There's some differences between the two. The 400 years was associated with affliction, being treated badly, and being put into bondage. And those were not all the same thing. The 430 years was in reference to being partakers of this covenant that Abraham had made with God. It would include being strangers in the land and sojourning in the land. And we can see where there are variations of each one of these within the text that I have listed. Genesis 15 says, "Know of a surety that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they will afflict them for 400 years. And then it says that God spoke to them on this wise that they should entreat them evil for 400 years. Well, that 400 years actually began with being afflicted by somebody of Egyptian descent. When Isaac was weaned, he was about 5 years old when he was through with all of the baby stage. He was being risen from the ranks from baby stage to child stage. And somebody started afflicting him and treating him very badly. And that individual was actually his brother, Ishmael, who was half Egyptian. So the 400 years of the Egyptians starting to treat the descendants of the promise, Isaac and Abraham's descendants, was when Isaac turned 5 years old. That is when we start to see Abraham be afflicted. Before this point, he's had entire nations pass him by as they were marching down to take over the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and take the people hostage. They totally bypassed Abraham. Didn't bother him at all. He lied to Pharaoh. Pharaoh is like, here, have some gifts and go away. All of the people, they didn't mess with Abraham up until the point when Ishmael started treating Isaac badly. And then all of a sudden we see people fighting with wells, and Abraham is being treated badly. And then Isaac, wells are being stolen. He is not treated the nicest. And then we have Jacob, who is running like a scared jackrabbit from anybody and everybody through the whole land and did not have a moment's peace. And in all of these verses, they're all considered, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as being called strangers in the land and sojourning in the land and being partakers of this covenant. And we can read this in Hebrews 11:9, where it actually comes out and says, by faith he, talking about Abraham, sojourned in the land of promise as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob and the heirs of promise with him of the same promise. If the 430 and the 400 years didn't begin until after the family had entered into after the family had entered into Egypt, how could Isaac be an heir of this covenant and being partaking of this covenant, because he never stepped foot in Egypt? So this is in reference to the whole duration of the time frame, not specifically how long they stayed in Egypt. If we look at a timeline, we can see where Abraham originally received this covenant when he was 75 years old. It was 25 years until Isaac was born. So we're going to take that 25 from the covenant to when Isaac is born. Then it was 60 years from when Isaac was born to when Jacob was born. And then from when Jacob was born to the entry into Egypt, that was 130 years, for a total of 215 years of the 430 years. That would be from when Abraham made the covenant with God to the Exodus. From that point, they're now in Egypt, and they had a sort of a calmer life. They got a brief reprieve. And then Joseph died, and all of his brethren and all of that generation, and a new king rose up. We can read about this in the first chapter in Exodus. When we are looking at Joseph's brethren, it's all of these individuals right here. We can actually go through, and because of the listing of all of these and the story that we know from Leah and Rachel, because we know how old Joseph was when Jacob entered Egypt, we can actually figure out how old all of the sons were in comparison with one another. So we know that Jacob got married after he had worked for 7 years for Leah. Then he worked another 7 years for Rachel. But during the first 7 years that he had worked, no children. During that next 7 years, all of the sons are born. When Joseph is born, he goes to his father-in-law Laban and says, okay, I now have all my kids. I've worked for you for 14 years. Let me go home. And Laban says, no, stay and work for your wages. And he works for Laban for another 6 years. But based on this information, we know that Levi is only 4 years older than Joseph. That comes into play when we're looking at how many years they stayed in Egypt, because we know that the life of Levi was 137 years. We know that Joseph was 39 years old when his family came into Egypt, which made Levi about 43 years old. And then if you take the 137 and you subtract the 43, that means that Levi lived 94 years in Egypt. And this is all before the enslavement of the Israelites took place. So if we go back to our timeline, we can add in that 94 years from the entry to when Levi dies. But we can also add in another huge chunk of time, because we know that when the Exodus occurred, Moses was 80 years old. So that only leaves this gap of time between when Levi died and when Moses is born. And if you've done the math and you've added it up, that chunk of time is actually only 41 years. So if we are looking at this prophecy and the 430 years from when Abraham made the covenant with God to the Exodus, we are talking about a time span of slavery possibly beginning 121 years at the most before the Exodus, and at the very least 80 years, simply by laying out the timeline and looking at the genealogical data that the book of Genesis provides us. Next on our list is the name of the pharaohs. How hard could it possibly be to find a name for a pharaoh? We have narrowed down when the Israelites existed from, we can pinpoint Moses' birth, Levi, Joseph, Abraham. We can find all of this information biblically speaking. So how hard could it be to pinpoint the pharaohs? Welcome to the wonderful world of the Egyptian dynasties, because nobody can agree upon anything. There's the high chronologies, there's the low chronologies, and then there's variations of those all in between. When we are looking at these, sometimes we know the number of kings. Like with the second dynasty, there were 5. But with the first dynasty, it is so debated, we can't say for certain. And then we have dynasties like the 7th and 8th that were at the same time, or the 15th, the 16th, and the 17th. Those ones are really tricky because they were all running concurrently, and there is so much uncertainty that we can't say who ruled or how many people ruled for any of them. What makes it super difficult when trying to align all of these names is that pharaohs had at least 5 names. There are some that were recorded with 8 and 12 names. There are a lot of names. You had your given name, your royal name, 2 different god names, the area that you ruled. There were so many different names. It's very, very difficult, especially when we're looking at the king's list, because the king's list could be complete, which is very rare. I don't know of a single complete king's list that's actually in existence. So what we are working with are selective lists and partial lists. So selective lists are, say we have kings A, B, and C, but King C didn't like King B, so King C completely left King B out of the loop of everything and only recorded King A. So it would appear that there were only 2 kings when there were actually 3. Or it could be that, like when we're looking at, say, the Abydos Kings list, all of these cartouches show potentially different kings, but some of them are duplicates because it's not a different king, but it's a different name for the same king. And unless it's noted that, hey, this is the same king, it will be recorded as a totally separate individual. So it can be extremely confusing. And then you have the partial lists like the Turin Kings list. Try reconstructing an entire kingdom based on these very small fragments. So these lists are fragmented, they're found from various different sources. They're not complete at all. Sometimes you can compare them with other known records, but sometimes the only place where they're listed is here. And again, we don't know if these lists were also selective because they could be both. So it's very, very confusing. Now, one of the things that a lot of individuals that are researching the kings will try to rely on is the sightings of the dog star, which is the brightest star in the sky. But it relies on a couple of things. So there are 6 records that talk about the rising of the dog star. The problem is that in these records, they don't list the reign that it occurred in. There's some debate on where they think they know the king who was the individual who recorded this, but there's not certainty there. But also, you have to know the exact location where the star was first observed to be able to align that with a timeline to give a specific date for said individual. So even though we have listings of the dog star, we actually can't use that information because we don't know exactly where it was observed. It could have been observed in northern Egypt, southern Egypt, central Egypt. If we don't know, then all of the calculations could be very wrong. Why didn't Moses name the pharaohs? Because Moses had been trained as a prince in the royal courts, and the standard practice was if you had an enemy, it was considered the greatest insult to not put the enemy's name in writing, because that was like recording them in stone for all of history. Their name would exist forever. And that was not something that you wanted your enemy to do. You wanted your enemy to disappear. So you wouldn't record their name, and therefore they wouldn't live in perpetuity. And it was the greatest insult. So while, yes, there were pharaohs that were kind to the Israelites at some point in history, like the Pharaoh of Joseph, Moses chose not to list any of the Pharaoh's names because he was not listing them as an individual type of relationship, but as a nation in general, a nation that was hostile towards his nation, which was the Israelites. So Moses was not looking at it on the individual scale, saying, well, this one was good and this one was bad. He was just listing it as a general term to reference the nation that his people were trying to escape and flee. So Moses used this, which was the biggest of insults, and he did not name the pharaohs. Now, there have been some talk about, hey, maybe this is King Tut. The Pharaoh of the Exodus was King Tut, or maybe Moses was King Tut. But because we know when the Exodus occurred, which is back in the 1440s BC, we know that King Tut actually lived after that, but we have some archaeological evidence that also proves this. And this archaeological evidence is called the Amarna letters. This is a series of about 400 tablets. It's just under 400. I think it's something around like 380, 382. And these are tablets that were found in Amarna, Egypt, that were sent to a series of Egyptian kings. It is the first mention of the Habaru, who are invading Canaan from the south. And the king, who is Adonizek, who is the king of Jerusalem, is writing the Egyptians saying, hey, you need to come help us because These Habaru are invading. They are making treaties with some of the individuals in this area, and I don't like that much. So we need to actually go through and we need to attack these traitors to our land because they're making these agreements with these people that we don't like that are coming up from the south. This sounds exactly like what we know Adonizek said in the book of Joshua, that we have his name in the Bible, we have his name on the tablets. We know that he was king in Jerusalem, and we know that he was writing because he was upset because the people of Gibeon had made a treaty with Joshua. We know that the Exodus took place in 1446. So we know that approximately the time that Joshua is going in to conquer the land of Canaan is somewhere around 1424 to 1397 BC. When we are looking at when the Amarna tablets are written compared to the wandering, the 40 years in the wilderness, we can actually see that the letters that the Amarna tablets were written to for these pharaohs, Pharaoh Amenhotep III and Pharaoh Akhenaten, whom was King Tut's father, they came much later than the wandering of the 40 years in the wilderness. So to say that Akhenaten or King Tut were in any way related to the events that happened at the Exodus is an impossibility, because these are the individuals that are being reached out to for help during the conquering of Canaan. So they occurred much, much later. So Amenhotep III, Amenhotep IV, otherwise known as Akhenaten, and King Tut, these are all impossibilities as rulers for the Exodus because of this thing called the Amarna letters. King Tut wasn't born yet. His grandfather and father were potentially not even born yet, or were very, very young children at the time. And they were the ones that were receiving the messages about Joshua. Who were the Exodus pharaohs? It could be one of the Tutmosises, but what we know as far as the current accepted dating methods, none of those match up. We do know that there is a lot of work to be done still in trying to properly align the Egyptian pharaohs and determine who was actually Moses's mother, adoptive mother, who was the pharaoh that would have acted as his grandfather. We really still don't know these individuals, but we can say for certain that it's not Ramses II, otherwise known as Ramses the Great. Uh, he is best known because he is the pharaoh that the Ten Commandments movie chose to use as the pharaoh of the Exodus during that movie from the 1950s that was done. And King Ramses the Great was known for his building projects. He did massive building projects. He also ruled for a very long time. He ruled for over 66 years. It is possible that he was over or near 100 years old when he died. He had 88 to 103 kids with somewhere between 48 and 50 sons. And if you are a little queasy about mummies, now's the time to turn your head, cover your eyes, because I'm going to show you a picture of Ramses' mummy. We have his mummy. We know that both of his firstborn sons from the two royal wives died years prior to his death. Neither one of those show signs of drowning or any other type of ailment that would have been directly related to the Exodus. And now I'm going to switch the slide to the mummy of Ramses. Now, when they are examining his mummy, there is no indication that he drowned. But then again, we do not have his lungs because they were removed for the mummification process. The mummy is not of the best quality, but we do know that he possibly had an infection due to an abscess at the root of the second molar on his left. So there is that probability, but he would have been very frail. if the Exodus had occurred during his rule, and they can't see an individual with these weakened bones, weakened muscles due to the advanced age actually jumping on a chariot and following the Israelites clear across the country. One of the sons of him was Meneptah. This is his stela. It's a 10-foot tall stela dated to the 5th year of his rule. He is the son that took over for Ramses II. And he was originally buried in one tomb, and then they moved him to another tomb. So he's a little hard to keep track of. And what's interesting about his stela is that he actually names Israel as a nation in the land of Canaan. And we know that he only ruled for 10 years. The Pharaoh, we know, died during the Exodus. And we know that the Israelites were in the wilderness in Arabia for 40 years. So they were not in the land of Canaan 10 years after the events of the Exodus. So for Meneptah to have listed Israel being laid waste and their seed is no more somewhere between year 0 and year 10, the stela is dated to year 5, that would indicate that they had been in Israel for quite some time in that land of Canaan, and that this is not in any way a possibility for these individuals to have been involved in the Exodus. And in addition to that, one of his brothers, another son of Ramses II, Kamawasset, he is actually called the father of Egyptology. And it is because of him that we actually have remnants of the Step Pyramid and the Djoser complex that is there in Saqqara. And we know that the Djoser complex was also one of the places that was highly revered because of its association with Imhotep, whom is the biblical Joseph. So it would seem very odd that the son of the Pharaoh, whom supposedly, was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and we have all of these plagues, and it left Egypt desiccated, would then go through, and Kamawasset would actually try to preserve the remnants of that nation and honor that nation. That does not seem like something that would be done at that particular time period. However, it does seem like something that would be done several hundred years later when the stories have gotten a little conflated and had a chance to calm down. We've been through several different dynasties, and we have pharaohs that are trying to rewrite history to appease their populace and make sure that they are considered the pharaoh and the official recognized leader of the government so that there were no uprisings. So the case against Ramses II, there's no evidence of destruction, the mass destruction that we would see at the time of the Exodus. He lived a very long life. There's no evidence that he drowned. His son Stella mentions Israel being laid waste by him, which they weren't in the land of Canaan at that time frame. And his other son restored Joseph's old sites. So those are the cases against Ramses, which now leads us to the part that you've probably all been waiting for. This is why you joined the program this evening. Is there any evidence of the Exodus? What is the archaeological proof of this? First, we're going to go see the tomb of Rekhmire. So this is a tomb of one of the visors under the pharaoh Tutmosis III. This was the stepson to Hatshepsut, and his son was Amenhotep II. This shows Nubians and Syro-Canaanite slaves that are making mud bricks. And we know that the Israelites made mud bricks, but there were a lot of people in this area that made mud bricks. But this is something to note, that we do have images in the tombs of people who are enslaved in Egypt that are making mud bricks for building projects. Then we're going to move to something that is called the Brooklyn Papyrus. Now, the Brooklyn Papyrus goes through and it has a list of Asiatic servants. Asiatic servants are also known as Canaanites and Syrians. And we know that the people of the Israelites were both from Canaan and Syria. And within this document, it is a list of household servants. A majority of them are women. And the names are very, very interesting because one of the first ones that I want to point out is Siphrah. Now, Siphrah is one of the midwives that is named in Exodus 1:15. Very, very interesting. But also interesting are the feminine forms of the names of Asher, Job, Jacob, Issachar. There are 95 people that are on this list, and 45 of them are of Asiatic descent. And this was a slave list for, or a list of servants for one of the wives of an advisor who was in the 12th and the 13th dynasty. So we're now looking at another potential dynasty that the Exodus could have occurred under. Moses was very specific about his genealogy. A lot of people think that Jochebed was just a descendant of Levi, but Moses is very clear that Jochebed was actually Levi's legit daughter who was born to him after they had moved into the land of Egypt. And Kohath, he was a little boy when they moved into Egypt. He may have been under the age of 2 when they first moved in. Amram, it is said that he was actually 10 years older than Jochebed, whom was actually his aunt. We start getting a very convoluted genealogies when we lay out the who begat whoms in the Bible. But this is, according to Moses' own accounts, his genealogy. When we are looking at Exodus 2:10, we learn that Moses was in a little bulrush ark. And we actually have an example from around that time frame, the mid-1500s BC. And this is a little basket that was woven. It was inside of the tomb of one of the officials' mothers. And this was an official typeset set. And this basket is definitely large enough for a little baby to have been in, 25 inches long, 15 inches wide, and about 9 inches high. So if you ever wanted to put an idea in your mind about what the ark, the little basket that Moses may have been floating down the river in, this would be a good idea of what it may have looked like. But Moses didn't always stay in Egypt. He, about 40 years into his life, made a very rash decision, and he ended up having to flee for his life to Midian. And he most likely took the King's Highway, which went straight across the upper Sinai Peninsula, straight into the land of the Midians. The Midianites were descendants of Abraham through one of his children with Keturah. So he went to people who should have been receptive towards him as a fellow relative. If you go to that area today, there's a place called El-Bada, and this location lays claim to having the well of Moses and the caves or the tombs of Jethro. So this is what is called the Well of Moses, where Moses, it is believed, would have met Zipporah, who is Jethro's daughter. And here's the inside of the well, where he would have had to fish out all of that water. These are the cave tombs. Now, the tombs themselves have undergone some renovation. These particular carvings that we are looking at right now were done sometime in the 1st century AD, but it is thought that they simply did some renovations to tombs that already existed in the area that were inside of these caves. And this is the inside of some of the caves that the tombs, we know, we can see where the bodies would have been placed. And it's thought that the Midianites, particularly Jethro, would have made use of some of these local caves to place their dead. Now we come to the most interesting, the largest piece of evidence from Egypt, from an Egyptian perspective, of the plagues. So this is called the Ipuwer Papyrus. Some people call it the Ipuwer Papyrus. It is an ancient papyrus that dates to the New Kingdom, which, from an Egyptian perspective, completely details the 10 plagues. It matches so closely to the biblical account from an Egyptian variation. And I'll talk about some of the variations as we go through, because we're going to look at the things that are mentioned within this papyrus. So just to refresh your memory, we're talking about the 10 plagues. These are a series of plagues that were sent to Egypt because the Pharaoh refused to let the people go. And each one of these plagues occurred probably in less than a year, because when Moses first went to stand before Pharaoh, he was 80 years old. And when he died, he was 120, and he led the Israelites for 40 years through the wilderness. So the plagues had to happen rather quickly. And based on what we know of the Nile and some of the plants that are mentioned that are affected during the plagues, we can pretty much pinpoint that for some duration in September to October, for a week, that the Nile River turned to blood. That the frogs occurred sometime in October. The lice probably were in November. The flies would have been sometime between November and January. Same thing with the animals being ill and the boils. The fire and hail, that would probably have occurred sometime mid to late February into March. The locust would have occurred sometime in March. The days of darkness, again, would have been either late March or early April. And the death of the firstborn would have occurred in mid-April. And each one of these particular plagues was actually associated with a god. It was like a dig at the heathen system. God's like, oh, you want to worship the Nile? Well, your god, Happy, is the god of the Nile. And we have your god of the floods, which the Egyptians relied upon. And so, well, we're going to make the Nile turn to blood. And the frog goddess, Heket, was the goddess of fertility, which was also associated with the Nile. Lice was associated with the god Geb, who was the god of the earth or the dust, and it said that the lice came from the dust. Kepfri was flies. This was the beetle god, the scarab god, otherwise known as flies. Some people have a translation that doesn't say flies, but says beetles. So this may be a better interpretation from what we know. The animals being ill, that's associated with the goddess Hathor, who was the goddess of the cattle, fertility, and motherhood. Sekhmet would have been associated with the boils because she was the goddess of disease and healing. Set was the god of storms and chaos, so it was quite fitting that God would approach the fire and hail and say, hey, your God can't do this, can he? And so he used the fire and the hail to say, Set is not the God of this. I am. Locust would have been associated with Osiris, who is the god of vegetation, among other things, also leading the dead. But what's interesting is that it makes note in Exodus 9:32 that the wheat hadn't been destroyed, probably because it hadn't germinated yet. But by the time that we get to Exodus 10:5, it is taken out, and we have the god of the grain, Neper, who is being targeted with this particular plague. Then we have Ra, who is the sun god, or Nut, who is goddess of the skies. And those would have been the ones that God said, oh, you're worshiping those? Well, I'm going to take away the sun from you for 3 days, and we'll see how strong your God is. And then finally, we have Osiris's wife, whom I'm not going to name simply because I don't want to get flagged because her name is now used for other things. But she is known as being the protector of children. And the 10th plague, of course, was the death of the firstborn. It was also a plague that was directed directly to Pharaoh because he considered himself God, or the God, the living God on earth. And God was showing him that, hey, you're not all that important. So for the first plague, we know the rivers turn to blood. When we are looking at the Ipuwer Papyrus, that is what I've got highlighted in yellow on this next couple of slides. And it talks about how plague is everywhere and the river is blood. No ifs, ands, or buts. The river is blood. Now, I will make note right now that the papyrus does not list the plagues in order, but it does have hints of all of the plagues. And by hints of all of the plagues, for the second, third, and fourth plagues, which were the frogs, the lice, and the flies, there's nothing that specifically mentions these individual plagues, but there is a reference back to Exodus 7:22, Exodus 8:7, and Exodus 8:18 through 19, where the magicians are actually doing their enchantments, and for some plagues, God allowed them to go ahead and do their little tricks. But by the time that we get to these end of these plagues, God was no longer allowing them to be able to do that. And within the papyrus, it talks about how the magicians are saying that the magic spells have been revealed to everybody. Anybody can do these things now. So that is a hint back at these particular plagues. But when we're talking about the plague of the livestock, we see that there was grievous murrain that was on the livestock. And within the papyrus, it says that the animals weep and that the cattle are moaning and groaning because of the events that are happening. If you go to the next plague, which was the plague of boils, it doesn't specifically mention boils in the papyrus. However, it talks about how the hair has fallen out for everybody, and you can't distinguish whose rank is whose. If you look at one of the symptoms of boils, it is hair loss, and boils that can be so bad that you can't even recognize an individual. So this would actually confirm the 6th plague. Then we move into the 7th plague, which was the hail mingled with fire, and how this hail and fire went through and it knocked out the barley crop. What is interesting is the papyrus specifically talks about the gates, the columns, and the walls being consumed with fire, and the barley perishing on all sides. Then we have kind of an intermission where the Bible talks about these things have not happened in Egypt since it began. And the papyrus talks about, behold, things are done here that have never happened before, or that have not happened for a very, very long time. So we're seeing similarities in that as well. When it comes to the 8th plague, it doesn't specifically mention locust. However, associated with the locust, we see where Pharaoh's servants are talking to him and saying, just let the men go, that they can go serve the Lord. Don't you know that Egypt is being destroyed? What are you waiting for? And we see in the papyrus where the servants and the advisors are saying, indeed, even the hot-tempered man says, if I knew where God was, I would go serve him. Why are they doing that? Because the Pharaoh is being stubborn and not letting the people go, and they're like, just go already. Thick darkness throughout the land. We know that there were 3 days where there was nothing. You couldn't see the hand in front of your face. And the papyrus talks about how the land is without light. There's not a house where one is not dead. The papyrus calls out and says, he who places his brother in the ground is everywhere. It's utter destruction. There are burials going on everywhere. It goes on further to talk about how the children of the princes have been dashed against the walls, again associated with the firstborn dying in Egypt. And then it talks about how what the ancestors foretold has happened. This has happened. And we read in Genesis 15:14 where God foretold what was actually going to happen. You're going to go there, I'm going to judge them, and you're going to come out with great substance. And speaking of great substance, what did they come out with? They borrowed all the jewels, the silver and the gold. And we read in the papyrus where the gold and the silver and the jewels are all strung on the necks of the maidservants. And how we read in the Bible about a mixed multitude that went up with them. And in the papyrus, it says that those who were Egyptians have become foreigners. They've given up on being Egyptian. They've aligned with foreign nations. It talks about, in this papyrus, how fire is mounted on high and its burning goeth forth against the enemies. And we know that the Lord actually came down and was a pillar of fire at night and a cloud by day. And if you think that that's all of the similarities, it goes on. It talks about how the waters returned and there remains not so much as one of them in the Bible. And if you look in the papyrus, it says, behold, Egypt is fallen to the pouring of water. That can also be a reference to the fact that Moses, they poured that water at the beginning of the plagues and water was poured at the end of the plagues. Talks about how the king has been deposed by the rabble, and we know that Pharaoh and his host were thrown into the sea. And that leads to the question, was the Pharaoh actually in the sea? And we read in the Bible that the horse of Pharaoh went into the sea. Pharaoh and his host went into the sea. I've gotten me honor upon Pharaoh and his chariots and his horsemen, and there remained not so much as one of them. If you go on further, it says the enemy will pursue and take, and they sank to the bottom as a stone. Who was the enemy? The enemy was mainly the Pharaoh and the upper rulers and advisors of Egypt. And the Bible says clearly that he saved them from the hand of him that hated them and redeemed them from the hand of the enemy. And the waters covered the enemy, and there was not one of them left. So this is Psalms. This is King David who is writing, and he says, there wasn't a single one of them left. So yes, the Pharaoh did die in the sea with the enemies. which brings us to putting that check mark there for, is there evidence of the Israelites in Egypt? Yes, we have the evidence. And not only that, we have an Egyptian account of the plagues. So I hope that answers any questions that anybody may have had about Israel and Egypt. We've learned and covered a lot of material throughout the program today. I see there's a comment about the names of the souls that went into Egypt are found in Genesis chapter 46. Levi's children, but no other descendants. And when they came out in Exodus 6, we see 3 generations. Yes, there was a lot of descendants. There's a list of, I believe it's 70 individuals that are associated with going into Egypt. And we see that they obviously had more children once they got into Egypt. We know that Joseph had more children because Jacob says, those children that are born to you after I came in, those are yours. But these 2 sons that were born before I came, they're mine. And we see where Moses says that Jochebed was born to Levi after they came into Egypt. A lot of people will say, oh, that's because they didn't name the girls. But if you actually go back to the list of individuals that came in with Jacob, we see where there was actually one little girl whose name was Sarah. So Sarah, the daughter of, I can't remember which one of Jacob's sons, but she was Jacob's granddaughter, and she was listed as one of the individuals who came into Egypt with the Israelites and was part of the 70. So we do know that they were rather young when they came in. They were in their 30s and 40s. So they had a long life in front of them. Most of the records that we have say that the children of Jacob died somewhere between the ages of 110 to 137. The stories that you read from things like the books of Jubilees and some of the Jewish traditions have ages for each one, usually around 120 to 125 years old. We don't have those dates from the Bible. We only have the dates for 2 sons. That would be Joseph and Levi. All of the other sons we do not know, but it is presumed that Benjamin, being about 10 years younger than all of the other children, would have actually been the last one to die, meaning that even though, according to all of the records, Levi was the longest living as far as he obtained the age of 137, that Benjamin lived longer than he did, dying about 5 years after Levi. But those are all, we can't confirm those biblically, but through the tales and traditions. But they had lived these very, very long lifespans. So there was definitely more individuals. And we see in some of the graves where there is an abnormally large number of females compared to males for the adults. And for the children, there was one archaeological review where it was talking about that there was an abnormally large number of infant males in one of the areas where they had been digging. So we would see that actually correlate with the Bible, because we know that there was a period of time when the Israelite baby boys were being wiped out, and we have a lot of females left at almost a ratio of 2 to 1. And that is what they were seeing in the one graveyard that they were looking at, is that the females outnumbered the males approximately 2 to 1, which means that the guesstimates for how many Israelites there were that went into the area of Sinai are actually much higher, because they were only looking at the numbers of males. And if the ratio was actually 2 to 1 for the females, then not only do we have 600,000 males, but we're talking upwards of 1.2 million women, in addition to the elders and the children. So we're talking some very, very large numbers. But I hope that you have found some of that information interesting. I try to stick with what is archaeologically provable and scientifically provable, but sometimes it's nice to dive into some of the mythologies and traditions just to get a general idea, because in every myth there is some kernel of truth. We don't know how much truth, but there's always at least a little tiny seed. So it's just a matter of finding which part is true and which part is totally and completely made up. And that's the fun of research. Do we have any other questions? So the fourth generation from the original 12 sons. So if we're looking at the individuals that came out of Egypt, we are looking at, let me go back to our chart that was for the sons of, for Moses' genealogy. Let me pull this back up. So we're going to pull this back up. So what we're looking at for, they'll come out in the fourth generation. Kohath is the youngest generation that went into Egypt. So if we are speaking from Kohath's perspective, it would have been Kohath, generation 1, Amram, generation 2, Aaron, generation 3, and Eleazar, generation 4. And Eleazar had to be under the age of 20 when they came into the wilderness, when they were doing the Exodus, because he actually was still high priest and survived the 40 years in the wilderness. And we are told that the only two people that were over the age of 20 who got to go into the promised land were actually Joshua and Caleb. Everybody else was condemned to die in the wilderness if they were the age of 20 and above. So we know that Eleazar was younger than 20, which would make him part of the youngest generation to exit Egypt. So from the youngest generation to go in, Kohath, to the youngest generation to leave, Eleazar, is the 4 generations. Do we have any other questions for this evening? I could sit here and talk all night long about the various generations and information that we're looking at, and can continue on into the wilderness, but next week is when we are going to be talking about the journey through the Red Sea, completely out of Egypt, and going into Mount Sinai and the region around Mount Sinai. Yes, Kohath, Amram, Aaron, and Aaron's sons could not have been 430 years in Egypt based on this fact alone. Yes, there's no possible way that they could have actually spanned that 430 years from when Kohath entered to when Eleazar left, because one, we know exactly how old Aaron was when they left, when the Exodus was. We know how old Kohath was when he died. We know how old Amram was when he died. And we know how old Levi was. And you don't get the ages and the dates if you try to extend that 430 years. But if you place them into a 215-year time slot, it works out beautifully. The pieces fall into place so easily that it's just amazing to see how it fits into place, knowing that, Moses and Levi are only separated by 41 years. Most people do not recognize that. And that alone, they were very close to the original patriarchs. So there's no reason why, being that close to the original patriarchs, that they should have fallen into such idolatry. Because when we're looking at Moses, we're looking at the next generation. These are people that actually his father and his grandfather knew Jacob, and they knew Levi and Joseph and all of these individuals. They had first-hand knowledge and first-hand accounts. There is literally no reason why they should have lost that knowledge. But their children and their grandchildren and great-grandchildren just they started caving to the peer pressure around them. All right, if there are no more questions, we'll go ahead and close out for the evening. If somebody does have a question later on, you're watching this on replay and not live stream, feel free, just drop the question into the chat box, send us an email, go online to our website. We can answer any questions that come in, be happy to do so. They might get answered on our Ask the Archaeologist program in addition to being replied to directly from whichever method you choose to ask. So go ahead, send those questions in. Plan on joining us next week at 6 p.m. Saturday evening, and we will be talking about the Red Sea crossing and Mount Sinai. Thanks for joining us and have a wonderful week.